I'd like to introduce my dear friend, Jen Maxey, Chief Program Officer for Holocaust Museum LA. Yes, please.
Thank you, Dawn. On behalf of Holocaust Museum LA, we want to thank the Wallace and Coy and Robert and Hannah and all of you here. This is our second collaboration with the Wallace in 2025, and it has been such a thrill. And I want to thank you also for bringing this show here, which of course, from our perspective at the Holocaust Museum LA, this is an incredibly important piece of work. So I'm so glad you're all here. So thank you. Thank you, thank you. We wanted to do something really special in connection with this piece of work tonight, so I think we've put together something that I hope will all be really meaningful for all of you. Our Chief Program Officer, Jordanna Gessler, who oversees not only our education department, but also our museum. She's been with us for 10 years, even though she will not look like she's been doing it for 10 years because she's so young and youthful. But Jordanna is also the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And we have asked Jordanna to be in conversation tonight with Audrey Stimson, who is an international journalist and an author, and who is bravely joining us tonight, I would say. Her grandmother was one of Hitler's head secretaries in Berlin. And so Audrey and Jordanna, who now do know each other, they have struck up a friendship, are going to be in conversation tonight. Because what this is about, friends, is this is about like taking these legacies and moving forward into a different world, right? Into a more humane place. And so we know that this conversation is going to be really meaningful. So please help me welcome Jordanna Gessler and Audrey Stimson.
My name is Jordanna Gessler. I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Holocaust Museum LA, and as you heard, my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. And I think this production does a really interesting job of discussing what is known in families. And I'm going to ask Audrey in a second to share a little bit about what was known in her family. But this idea of silence, of conversation, of knowledge, of family legacy and roles, I am sure other people who have survivors in their family understand this when I say there was never a time I didn't not know about the Holocaust. No one ever sat me down and said, in the beginning of my life, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and took the whole story from A to Z. But it was simply woven into the fabric of every single day life. It would be doing a school assignment on my family tree, or wondering why there were no photographs of my grandparents' childhood, or no objects or artifacts or anything related to it. Or it would be my grandfather at dinner hysterically crying because he remembered seeing children my age being murdered in front of him. And Audrey, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about your family and what you knew growing up.
Sure. First of all, I have to clarify, my grandmother was not Hitler's secretary, but my grandmother was working as the head telephone operator in the Military General Command Center in Berlin. So her role in that command center was to listen into all of Hitler's conversations with the generals out in the front. So that's a clarification there. But it's very rare in Germany to have grandparents or relatives talk about this time, as you saw from the play. So I grew up from a very young age. My mother was born in 1933 in Berlin, and my grandmother was in her 40s during that time, 30s and 40s. So when I grew up, it was part of the dinner conversation. It would always come up after a few glasses of wine as a very young age, all of it, from the atrocities of the Battle of Berlin and what the Russians did, that for sure. And then my grandmother did talk about listening into these conversations. Specifics are very vague, but one conversation was when Berlin was attacked by the Russians, that Hitler was irate and said, "You have no more ammunition. Throw the damn cannons in the River Spree," and that was shortly before he died. He killed himself. So that was mine, but it was always part of my world. This understanding of war and of her role in it. And so we did have dinner conversations, and I had aunts and uncles. Her brother was killed 3 days before the war ended in Berlin, shot in the head. So war was part of my world.
And would you say that that was typical for your generation of growing up?
No, not at all. I have friends here, German friends. They not only heard nothing, they didn't dare ask about it. It was just not something that people talked about. And I wondered now, as an adult, my grandmother died when I was 31, why they did that. And in explicit details, also about rapes and things. And we had to sit there and listen to this. And I wondered why she was doing that. And yet, at the end, the pat answer, she would always say, "But nie wieder Krieg, never again war." And the reason why I'm sitting here today is because that struck me. I'm half American. My mother married an American, and that struck me. And I want to personify that to my soul, that never again war means more than just that phrase. It means feeling the pain of what we saw today and what we know, all of the atrocities, feeling that grief and that sorrow for humanity. And that's why I want to talk about it.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think this play and this production does such a wonderful job of balancing stories and material evidence. And I'm someone who loves history, if you know me, and studied Holocaust history in undergraduate and graduate school, and always really believed in the power of material evidence, especially in museums. And I currently work at Holocaust Museum LA, where we have galleries filled with artifacts and objects and photographs. And I think one other important piece of this, and what is really true to our education philosophy and what we saw in this production, is the stories of the survivors themselves, and the way that personal histories can really foster empathetic conversations between one another. And I've seen this firsthand time and again, and I think we are all seeing it currently. But I'll never forget when I first started working at the museum 11 years ago. I was at a school, a Title I school here in Los Angeles. Actually, the majority of the students we work with are not Jewish, do not identify as Jewish. 99% of them do not. And I'm standing in a classroom, and I'm there to talk about the Holocaust. And I just happened to mention offhand that my grandparents were survivors. And 30 minutes later, I ask if there are any questions, and all of these hands go up, specifically asking me questions about my grandfather. And it was really in that moment that I understood the power of storytelling, the power of personal impacts of people that witnessed the witnesses. And that is the responsibility I feel in continuing to do this work, to share these stories. And I know you touched a little bit about this responsibility, but I'm wondering if you could share more about what your responsibility feels like.
Well, fast forward, I work for the largest German television network, ARD, and as a news producer. And for me, it's about the truth. We can't shirk away from the truth. What is that truth? It can be extremely painful, and we need to sit there and feel that in our bones so that we will never, ever repeat any of this. So I think there is a responsibility in telling these stories, and that I am a descendant, and I want to say, here I am. You can look at me, and I am as we all are, and we need to tell our stories. And Jordanna needs to tell her story. I want to hear your stories, and that's how we can hopefully prevent any of this from ever happening again. And that's the most important thing. I mean, do I feel guilty or shameful? Yes, I feel a responsibility to. My grandmother told a lot of stories about Berlin. My mother was traumatized. My mother was extremely traumatized from what happened. And I don't want that to ever happen anywhere on this planet ever again. The othering, the hatred, the fear, that shouldn't be part of our existence on this planet, and we need to open our arms and live in love. That's what I believe in.
You actually said something so interesting to me yesterday, which was that you, and I'm now paraphrasing.
We were on television.
Before television, though, you said this. You said that we can't swipe through our feelings, that we have to sit with it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing, is that people always want to look away. They easily. And in this sort of shortened attention span world where we live in, it's very easy to say, oh, we're just going to swipe right, swipe left, swipe down. And we can't do that. We need to look at those images. We need to look at sort of horrific things and say, wow, how did this happen? What does that really feel? How do I feel in my bones about this? Do I need to cry? Do I need to hug my husband, my dog, my sister, my brother, and say, I love you? We need to do that every single day.
What we saw in many of these photographs on stage were mostly upper, middle workers or people within this Nazi machine of genocide. This was not Hitler, Himmler, Göring, Goebbels, Eichmann, the names that we tend to associate with the Holocaust. And I can tell you with most certainty that my grandparents didn't see Hitler and Goebbels and Himmler. Most survivors didn't. But they did see the people in these photographs. And the majority of them went back to their lives afterwards. And so really considering what we are taking away from this, what we are learning, what we are thinking about when we see these images, when we're in Holocaust museums, and what each individual role plays. And I thought it was very interesting at some point in the production, they were talking about how we need to look at the human beings in this, right? We always talk about at the museum that human beings have capacity. And that's what the Holocaust shows us, that they have the capacity to do the most horrific things to one another. They also have the capacity to do the most courageous things for one another. And those are the lessons that I like to take with it. But understanding that this is a different way of experiencing history. And I think in recent years, there's been a lot of excitement around productions of history in the theater. Tony-winning award productions. But it's a way to bring in new audiences to history and a way to have important conversations with people who might not always walk into a Holocaust museum, although I feel like many of you have, but maybe not all of you. And it's a new audience, a new lens, a different lens for us to really explore human capacity, explore history. And I'm wondering also, Audrey, if you could share why you think it's important for a production like this to exist and how it can transform people's thinkings and minds.
Well, I think artistic expression as such, telling these types of stories, brings an intimacy between the viewer and the performer and the performance, and an intimacy of history that it's hard to get, and to feel this and to have this play, I think is very, very important. So that I think it's important to tell that, to have that experience as a spectator, and it brings people closer. Yeah.
For sure. I want to open up for an opportunity for a few audience members to ask some questions. But what I will mention is this is only just the beginning of this story. There are so many people who've been identified in these photographs and so much to learn from it. In fact, one of the doctors who's in these photographs, Carl Klauberg, was in charge of medical experiments on women with sterilization, the OBGYN experiments in Auschwitz. And I happen to personally have known a survivor of these experiments. And so for each of us, I would say the intention that we are leaving with is not just the knowledge of these joyful, happy images, but really consider what these people chose to do every day. And there's tons of studies done about theories on doubling and how people created different sense of selves, but really considering what more is there to learn? Whose story can we uncover? And how can we honor those victims and those survivors? So I hope you all leave sort of thinking with that. And I want to give an opportunity for you guys to ask one or two questions of either of us about the production, about the work.
Thank you for taking the question. As the head of a German news channel, or the program, can you give us a perspective, and what would you say to Americans in the face of what's happening in our country now with Trump? I think it's completely salient to the topic, because once again, people are looking away, like you were talking about. And I just wonder what is the perspective from Europe on that?
My job as a half German, half an American, thank you for the question, is reporting about the United States to Germany, and that's my specialty. So I'm working on a documentary on the current, I think his name is Donald Trump, first 100 days in office. It's difficult, as we all know. You know, Europe has been a staunch ally post. I grew up. My father was a foreign service officer. He was actually in the CIA, so that's another part of my past, very complicated life that I've lived, and you know, we fought cold, thank goodness, and we brought Europe together. Created NATO. That is all now being torn apart. It's a sad time, and a time where we all need to get up and say, maybe some things we should embrace the allies that we've had and not isolate ourselves. Isolation won't help us, won't help the world. And if we want peace, we have to be part of the world, part of the global brotherhood of sisterhood and brotherhood and of man and humanity, and we can't turn away from that, not at all. And the Germans are very, very sad. It's a very sad time.
Thank you for both being here. I wondered what your initial reaction was in the play when they said we shouldn't show people these photos, because originally I kind of agreed with that, and I always feel that way about mass shooters and whatever. Don't give them any attention. And if you both have felt that way at all and then evolved, and also how you feel on the opposite end about showing, for example, the worst photos from things like a mass shooting. Do you think that the more we see, the more we can't look away, perhaps the more we would care?
So for the first question, I think it's incredibly important, and this is talked about in the production, how USHMM really built out their core to be about the victims and the survivors. And this is also true at Holocaust Museum LA and other museums. It's a common narrative. That is critical. These are not museums dedicated to the perpetrators. However, to not show the perpetrators leaves out the story. And I think this is also said in the play. 6 million Jews did not kill themselves. It was perpetrated by human beings. And actually, I know that there are a few people here who've done docent training at our institution know that I'm very against using the word evil when describing this because it feels like an out, right? It is saying, because then it allows people to say, well, I'm not evil, right? And so I think that it is critical to show the people behind it. And I actually think these photographs are better than some of the ones of people just in their uniforms posing because it is showing how they spent their days after. So I think it's very, very important to add this. It should not be the majority, but it needs to have a space. As far as really traumatic images, I think there is a time and a place for them. I think there happens to be a bad case of people sort of zoning out or being desensitized, which is definitely a challenge. But I don't think we should ever eliminate spaces for looking at material evidence and truth. I think it needs to be done at the right age, in the right context, in an appropriate way so people truly understand history. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, we can look back at, the Vietnam War. We saw death, we saw things. Iraq War was desensitized a little bit. And so, certain things, yeah, I agree that it's difficult with perpetrators, mass shooting, I agree with that, not glorifying any of that. But it is important, as we saw from the play, to look these people in the eye and the descendants to say, oh, that was my grandfather, and to sort of come to a reckoning, and for Germany also, again, to have that feeling of this is horrible. These are men, these are women. My grandmother was just a functionary. My grandfather was one of the head bureaucrats. He got a Medal of Honor for organizing the 1936 Olympics. So that's another side. And he was for sure in the Nazi Party. I'm still doing history on all of that. But yeah, but we need to see the faces. I think it's very important to say they're not just faceless evil monsters. They're human beings, as Jordanna says. And that should be a warning to all of us.
I think we have time for one more. Is that okay? We have
That's
one
exactly
right,
what I was going to say.
right over here. There's one right here. Sorry.
Thank you both for this talk and your time. Audrey, I wanted to ask you, you spoke about having these dinners with your family where things were said, and maybe you didn't ask the questions or say the statements at the time, but I wonder if you could have dinner with your grandparents now. What might you ask them, or what might you say to them?
Well, that's a very good question, because as a young child growing up, and then we started hearing the same stories over and over again, at a certain point when we were teenagers, we said, well, I mean, didn't you know what was going on? Didn't you see what was going on? And my grandfather died before I was born, and my grandmother ended oftentimes some of these stories, and her sisters would say, oh yes, we hid the Jewish family, the Cohen family. It came, for some reason, that's name Cohen came up, in the basement down the street, remember? And everybody said, yes, yes, oh yeah, we hid the family. And the story goes, and it's very bizarre, that they lived through the war successfully, this Cohen family, and at the end of the war, a few weeks after the end of the war, they went out mushroom hunting, and the entire family died. Conveniently, is it true or not? Is it? I mean, I'm trying to deal with that. I've been trying to deal with that for decades now. Is that a real true story? I have 3 brothers, and they all said, "How could you come up on stage and talk about our grandmother?" And I said, "I have to." And also, they said, "Okay, then tell the story about the Cohen family." I said, "Do you guys still really believe that?" And they said, "Yeah, that was what was told." My grandmother was I was extremely close to her because my mother was traumatized and a bit nuts. I mean, psychologically traumatized and had massive problems. But my grandmother took care of me. And so there was that dichotomy, like, what did she do? Why didn't she get up? Why didn't she say something to Hitler on the phone, right? I mean, what could you do? What could, they knew what was happening. She knew. She listened. She knew what the troops were doing and what the German Wehrmacht was doing and where things were happening and when the end came. She knew it. My grandparents had Mein Kampf annotated books in their possession. But they also had a book called Mein Leben in Dachau, which is my life in Dachau. So another book in German about a survivor. But they annotated that too, but I don't have it. My younger brother, who lives in Europe, has those books. So what would I ask them? How could you? Could this happen again? Is that the question? Yes. How do we stop it? How do we stop it? How do we all not say, well, somebody else is going to take care of this? I don't think somebody else is going to take care of us. We all have to be courageous. We all have to get, and as Elie Wiesel said, the opposite of hate is not love, it's indifference. It's indifference. We can't be indifferent to things. When we see hate, when we see people othered and ostracized, we have to stand up for them. That's the only way. And even if we are pushed to the side, we have to stand with the people pushed to the side. And we have to say, here I am. I'm for you. You're for me. I'm for Jordanna and all of you. That we got to do that.
Thank you all for staying and listening to this dialogue. Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you, Jordanna.
I know that this really is the beginning of a conversation that I think we will all leave with about how we can all be responsible for creating a world of mutual respect. So thank you.